こんにちは。コラゾ・ウィリアムと申します。ディアフィールドビーチ高校で教えております。フロリダ州にあります。よろしくお願いします。Well, from a very young age, I was involved in martial arts. I started karate when I was about 5 years old. And this was during a period of time that this was becoming a very popular thing. Schools, martial arts schools were becoming more and more popular in the 70s and 80s. I've just dated myself. I'm a little embarrassed. But one of the things that I think was most impactful for me was that I had a couple of very important trainers early in my life who had lived in Japan. They were both Marines, had spent quite a bit of time in Japan. And so for them, it was important for them to teach a lot about culture and a certain amount of respect for the art itself. And that really, I think, made a difference for me as a young person. So I had always had an interest in Japan for that reason. I think that, but later in life, as I sort of took on this interest in Japan, and it was personal at the very beginning. When I decided to go away to school, I grew up in South Florida and went to school in New York at Cornell University in Ithaca. And they had a really great Asian studies program, and I decided that that's where I really wanted to be. I found my classes to be exhilarating. I found a new life in that respect. And so from that, I studied more about Japan, thought I was going to do more college teaching, but then I went on JET. And as part of the Japan exchange and teaching program, I think really changed my life as far as how I wanted to share the things I really enjoyed learning about with young people. I lived in Hiroshima Prefecture, but I think what was amazing about that experience in particular was that because it was so close to, of course, Hiroshima City, and it being a very metropolitan city, it was such a contrast in so many wonderful ways to live in a rural area within Hiroshima Prefecture. In fact, I lived on a small island called Osaki Kamijima, which is not too far from places like Takehara and Mihara. Most people know Mihara because it's off of the Shinkansen line. And so there's something about island culture that calls to me. My family's from Puerto Rico, and I have always felt a certain level of kinship with people who have grown up on islands and so on. Even though I didn't grow up myself, there was so much culture that I had learned as a child about how to talk to people, how to be with people and spend time with people. And it really made a difference for me, I think. And so living in Japan, of course, can be so many things to so many people. But I think for me, it was a life calling that I found while I lived there. I learned a lot about myself, and I learned a lot about Japan. And I think learning about Japanese culture really made a difference for me, and I wanted to come back and share that, and I felt that was sort of my imperative to do that, and so I've done that. I came back. I started teaching the year after I came back from Japan. Did some graduate school for a couple of years, and then went right back into public schools and taught. And I've been at the same school for the last 20 years. So. I very much enjoy it. I've thought a lot about this question, actually. This is a tough one because I think there are lots of different stories I could tell. But I think what's probably most interesting in the process of this, and I'm going to put this into the context of South Florida. South Florida is where I grew up. I was born and raised here. I was born in New York, I'm sorry. But I was raised in the South Florida area from the age of one and a half. And so for me, learning about Japan was like this new and very interesting thing that I didn't come into the culture directly with. And so I think it was it was more of a fascination of wanting to know more that really drove me. But now that I've come to live here, there have been a lot of different associations that are here: the Japan America Society of South Florida, Japan America Society of Miami, and our connections to sister cities. And I've really gotten to know a lot of really great people in these associations and have been involved in these kinds of things. But I think what's interesting is that my knowledge of Japanese has opened up doors in ways that I never really expected. Of course, I mentioned earlier that I am, I've been doing martial arts since I was 5. I started doing kendo, Japanese fencing, when I was in college, I think my sophomore year, and continued to do that. I was worried that I was going to come back from Japan, where I was doing 6 days a week of training there. Coming back to South Florida and finding sort of a desert of martial arts, kendo, in particular. And so I was totally wrong. And I've found a great community here. And in this process, my knowledge of Japanese has actually aided the community in providing opportunities for others to train and learn from masters that I could translate for. And so I've done a lot of interpretation in the course of many years of kendo training. I think one of my favorites, and this is the anecdote, I set that up for a context. One of my favorites absolutely is when I got to meet the world champion at the time, kendo, Eiga Sensei, who anybody who does kendo knows who I'm talking about. I don't even have to give you a first name. That's how impressive he is. And he's originally from Hokkaido. And I think one of my favorite moments with him was when I first met him, and I was just in awe in general. And what was true is that I had done a Shugaku Ryoko with my school in Hokkaido. So I think he was completely shocked when I mentioned that I had visited Hokkaido, and he just mused at the idea that somebody spoke Japanese and had been to Hokkaido from South Florida. and we had, from that point forward, we talked quite a bit, and we actually I still correspond with him on the occasional level. He's of course busy, and so but that was, I think, a wonderful moment of connection that I think is so rare when you don't have at least some skills of cultural connection or linguistic ability to share it. And I like to use that in my classroom setting a lot, to talk about how important it is that we as people in this world connect through language and culture. So. For me, the struggle in learning Japanese and studying Japanese has always been a level of practice. That is to say that when I studied in college, I worked very, very hard at speaking and getting comfortable with speaking. I was a very shy young man, so when I started learning Japanese, I think it took a lot of effort on my part to try to feel like I could speak up. And so I'm very aware of some of my challenges in back then versus now, and I try to share that with my students regularly. When I see a student have a similar kind of problem that I've had, I make it very much a point to share some of my own struggles. And I think it's always important for a non-native speaker of the language to really speak to that experience with their students. I think they appreciate that. I think it's a source of inspiration for me because I've always worked at this, and I expect them to work for me, my students. And I playfully say with them all the time, laziness offends me. I worked hard for this, and you should work hard too. Work with me, have some fun with me, and we can work hard together, And I think that's probably the most important part of language learning in general. but especially Japanese. I think there's a level of humility in the language in many cases that students really have to, especially American students, really have to think about and be aware of, and really try to you know, connect with when they communicate. And it you know, we have our challenges.